The infamous convicted serial killer Paul Bernardo was up for parole in November, and this was his third go at it. Bernardo was arrested in mid-February of 1993, and he was convicted of first-degree murder in September of 1995 in the deaths of 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey of Burlington, Ontario, and 15-year-old Kristen French of St. Catharines, Ontario. He was given sentences of at least 25 years without parole for each. He was also convicted of kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and committing indignity to a dead body. His third victim was his young sister-in-law, 15-year-old Tammy Humolka, who was drugged, raped, and killed by Bernardo and his then-wife, Karla Humolka, Tammy's older sister, on Christmas Eve of 1990. Bernardo was convicted of manslaughter in Tammy's death. On top of the concurrent life sentences for the Mahaffey and French murders, he was declared a dangerous offender. His dangerous offender status came with an indeterminate sentence on top of his other life sentences, hence his continued incarceration. On November 26th, he had his third attempt at a parole hearing, and we're going to go through the timeline of the hearing. The parole hearing began at 9:40 a.m. at La Casa Medium Security Institution. It's about 2 hours from Montreal. Paul Bernardo, who is now 60 years old, has been behind bars for more than 30 years. There were 3 representatives of the Parole Board of Canada who oversaw procedures. 6 victim impact statements were read at the hearing. The 2 Parole Board of Canada commissioners, who are also the decision makers, studied Bernardo's file, but they were seeking complementary information. Their focus, they said, was on risk assessment. At 10:15 a.m., Paul Bernardo is told that he is not, under any circumstances, to address the victims directly. He is in the room, but hard to see on the video feed as he is at the bottom left of the screen. Persons referred to as Victim 2 and Victim 3 provided statements via video conference as to the impact of the murders on their own children. They vowed to defend their memory and fight for the victim's dignity. A person referred to as Victim 4 is providing a statement via video conference. They say they wanted to travel to be at the hearing in person but were unable to. They speak of intergenerational impacts of the loss of Kristen French, who was 15 years old when she was murdered by Paul Bernardo. At 10:35 a.m., heart-wrenching victim impact statements continued, but it was difficult to hear for those who had joined in via the teleconference. Lawyer Tim Danson had expressed anger and disappointment of the families of the victims last week after they were told they were to join remotely. That is horrible. They weren't even allowed to be there in person. The parole board made accommodations, and they were allowed to be present and to make statements in person, but some were not able to make the journey on short notice. During the impact statements, the mother of one of the 3 Ontario schoolgirls who told the Parole Board of Canada that he was an endless threat who must never walk free. She said, "I remain hopeful that you understand the sadistic, manipulative, and psychopathic nature of Bernardo's behavior and the endless threat he represents to public safety." At the age of 60, Bernardo has shaggy, long, and gray hair. He sat at a table with slumped shoulders and a blue t-shirt, which stretched over a modestly dumpy body. He often nodded occasionally, scratched his head, stroked his hair. During one victim impact statement, he appeared to wipe his eyes and nose. During others, he sat like a stone. Leslie's mother went on to say that sadistic sexual psychopaths like Paul Bernardo are incapable of understanding and apologizing for what he did to Leslie. She said, "We know from experience that dangerous offenders do exist, do destroy beauty, hope, and dreams." Donna French, the mother of 15-year-old Kristen French, who met a similar fate, said the following: "Each day I'm not able to hug her, kiss her, tell her how proud I am of her and how very much I love her. For a mother, that is agony, which there is no words." Kristen's friends are all now married and have children. Her boyfriend at the time of her abduction is now a grandfather, and one of her best friends is a grandmother. They are grandparents. Kristen never even got the opportunity to become a mother. The worst nightmare I still have to contend with is the thought of another sweet, innocent child having to go through what Kristen, Leslie, and all the other victims went through. As long as there's any possibility of that happening, there will be no peace of mind. In June 15th of 1991, Paul Bernardo approached Leslie Mahaffey late at night and pulled a knife on her. He drove the 15-year-old to his house in St. Catharines, Ontario. He shared the house with Karla Humolka. There, the couple, in the words of the parole board, sexually, physically, and verbally assaulted her for several days, often video recording the abuse. After deciding that she could identify both Bernardo and Humolka, they drugged her and strangled her rather than releasing her. They dismembered her body and encased it in cement blocks and distributed it around the area. 10 months later, when the couple seemed convinced that they had gotten away with the horror, they did it again. They picked out 15-year-old Kristen French as their next victim. On April 16th of 1992, they found a young girl walking home from high school. Bernardo's wife at the time, Humolka, lured her to the vehicle under the pretense of asking for directions. After Bernardo displayed a knife, they forced her into the vehicle despite her struggles. They took her to their residence and both sexually, physically, and verbally assaulted her for several days, drugging her when she was defiant. Again, they made video recordings of the abuse. They strangled her on April the 19th and then attended a family Easter dinner before returning home to dispose of her body by the side of the road near the first girl's gravesite. The two were linked by police, and a large probe was launched amid a public panic of a killer on the loose that left its mark on a generation of Ontarians. The police probe widened to include unsolved sexual assaults dating back to 1987. Humolka, after being beaten by Bernardo, lawyered up and talked to police, portraying herself as a victim forced to help her husband, the R word, and kill not only Leslie and Kristen, but also another teen girl before them. That victim was 15-year-old Tammy Humolka, Humolka's own sister, who the couple drugged, raped, and killed on Christmas Eve of 1990. Bernardo was also convicted of manslaughter in her death. When Bernardo appealed his convictions, he claimed that while he kidnapped and raped his victims, it was Humolka who killed them. His appeal was rejected. At 11:05, the hearing was resumed. Bernardo is seated at the conference table across from members of the parole board. He looks straight ahead as victims in the room speak of protecting the memories and dignity of the victims that Bernardo tried to steal from them. Ryan Mahaffey, Leslie's brother, also spoke. He was 7 years old when his sister was killed. He said, "Today I'm 40. I have been blessed with 2 beautiful children, an opportunity stolen from Leslie. My partner and I agonized over what to name our kids. We wanted to honor Leslie by name, but we couldn't for fear of what they would find if others Googled their names. My daughter looks strikingly like Leslie, and it warms my heart, but also sometimes hurts like hell." He told the parole board of the perpetual hell Bernardo bestowed upon his family. 2 nieces of Kristen French and a sister also spoke, telling of generational trauma of Bernardo's crimes. Also speaking to the board was one of Bernardo's many sexual assault victims, who spoke of the terror of him holding a knife to her throat. At 11:20 a.m., Tim Danson, the longtime lawyer of the families, read a part of the victim impact statement on behalf of his clients. It refers to the significance of the designation of Bernardo as a dangerous offender and the importance of keeping him behind bars. At 11:45 a.m., a person identified as Victim 1 explains that this is the first time they are addressing a parole hearing for Paul Bernardo, saying he shows no remorse, no compassion, no regret, and no regard. They say the topic of his crimes comes up more than members of the parole board can imagine in social settings, at work, and elsewhere. Victim 1 worries about people finding out that they are among victims. That night, I thought I would die by the knife he held to my throat. Bernardo spoke the most of his parole hearing, consuming hours over the afternoon, answering questions from the parole board. He showed absolute fluency with prison administration jargon, acronyms, and policies, and a warm embrace of psychological theory and clinical language. He talked a lot about factors: fractured self-esteem, making people lesser thans, power and control, over-compassion through exaggerated aggressiveness, internalization and victimization, meaning him, not his victims. When referring to his childhood, Paul said that he took the victim stand, and his crimes were revenge for that. I was the very bad bastard child. The power and control he felt when abusing and raping women suppressed that feeling, replacing it with high happiness. His emotional display was clearest at the parole hearing when speaking of his mother who died in 2022. When challenged by the board why this version of his criminal origin story hadn't been heard before, he said his mother didn't want it public. The board chastised him for speaking in the third person. His explanations were peppered with you instead of I, and speech seemingly called from therapy textbooks. "Are you a narcissist?" he was asked. His answer was, "I am effectively managing it." He said his recent months in his new medium security prison has been a huge relief after decades of solitary confinement in maximum security, which he referred to as a dungeon and torture. At his current facility, he is in a single room, but in the general prison population. He works in a prison landscaping crew. "I have friendships and meaningful contacts," he said. "I love the job." The length of time he has been locked up was highlighted by Bernardo telling the board, "I've never been on the internet. It was invented after I was in prison." He told the board that he was adamant he was ready for release. His institutional parole officer, Rose Kendall, told the parole board that CSE believes that the risk Mr. Bernardo poses to society during such absences is undue. "We believe he has further work to do. We believe it would be too early to consider access to the community." Now, it is unusual for any inmate to be granted parole without support from the institution that's holding him. All 6 victim impact statements were delivered. The board explained that the case will now be presented. Then there will be questions and later a break, and after that, Bernardo will speak. At 12:05 p.m., a caseworker detailed Bernardo's situation at a medium security prison. In May of 2023, Bernardo was transferred to La Macasa, which the caseworker describes as a much more open environment. Since then, Bernardo has remained compliant and no incidents have been reported. But the caseworker believes he tends to overestimate his progress and underestimate the risk of his release. At 1:15 p.m., Bernardo speaks. He spoke to the board about the abuse he says he endured at the hands of his parents, how he feels his case is being assessed, and what he believes the board has to take into account. He says he is not at the hearing to show he is accountable. At 1:45 p.m., Bernardo describes his upbringing. He's asked what pushed him to commit criminal acts, or in other words, to explain the root of his offenses. He says that at age 16, his mother told him the man he believed was his biological father was in fact not. He says his biological father saw him and did not want custody, and that his adoptive father hated him for being the son of his rival. He added his mother didn't want anything to do with him. A commissioner says background of abuse and neglect do not generally lead to offenses, and particularly not to Bernardo's crimes. At 4:28 p.m., Paul Bernardo was denied parole for the 3rd time in front of the Parole Board of Canada.
He didn't show any emotion, no empathy, no insight. He tried to give an explanation to justify why he did what he did, and that was deeply, deeply disturbing.
Bernardo, now 60 years old, stared straight ahead as 6 heart-wrenching victim impact statements were read. Kristen French's mother spoke of being re-traumatized every time a parole hearing comes up. Leslie Mahaffey's brother Ryan also spoke of losing his sister when he was just 7 years old. He didn't just steal my sister, mentor, and best friend, but through grief, my mother and father too, he said. Mahafi's mother delivered a powerful statement in person. She was at one point overwhelmed, though, and longtime family lawyer Tim Danson read part of her statement. It said, having murdered my daughter and violated her with unspeakable sadistic brutality, my duty, my responsibility, and that of my family is to protect Leslie's memory, saying she needed justice for her daughter. And justice, the victims insisted, is that Bernardo spend the rest of his life behind bars. And it took just 30 minutes of deliberations for the parole board to conclude the risk of releasing Bernardo was just too high.
There was a great article from the National Post about this parole hearing. It was a little bit more in depth, so I wanted to read this to you guys. After denying him for the third time, the Parole Board of Canada explains its decision in a written ruling which was just released Wednesday. They said that Paul Bernardo continued to minimize his monstrous behavior, and he just can't be paroled yet. The parole board refused Bernardo any form of release. That all included full parole, day parole, and unsupervised temporary absences. He also received a psychiatric assessment determining him to be a psychopath, as well as a severe sexual sadist with narcissistic personality disorder. In the most recent psychological risk assessment of September of 2024, based upon the interviews with you, the parole board wrote in its decision, a review of file information, and the application of actuarial assessment tools, the psychologist assesses a moderate low risk for general violent recidivism, which is higher in a spousal context. The risk of sexual recidivism was assessed as being above average. The psychologist noted that this all calls for caution. The board noted that Bernardo came to the attention of police in connection with several sexual assaults to which he later confessed. He himself estimated sexually assaulting around 20 victims. They said you were arrested in February of 1993 and charged at first with the Scarborough rape offenses. You have remained incarcerated ever since. You described your treatment by your parents as far worse than what you had been previously described in your file and what you had previously shared with the board. You say you were punished, degraded, tortured, humiliated, ridiculed, crushed, rejected, abandoned, and discarded by them. At the hearing, you said your mother had been sexually abused by numerous men, but that she did not want this information to become public. She and your father both died in 2022, hence your late sharing of the extent of her victimization and the extent of the abuse you suffered from both parties. You associated with extroverted and macho peers who prioritized maintaining their public image by using money and sexual conquests. As reflected by the psychiatrist who's completed the dangerous offender application in November of 1995, you adopted a predatory pattern which, in his professional opinion, is a manifestation of sexual sadism. That diagnosis has also been found in clinical assessments done in 2022 and 2024. You have been under federal custody since November of 1995. You remained in a maximum security institution for approximately 28 years, of which 17 were spent in segregation because of your high-profile status and a constant threat to your safety from other inmates. In November of 2022, you applied for a transfer to a medium security institution in the region. It was granted. You were transferred in May of 2023. At the hearing, you mentioned that you had learned to deal with openness in your physical environment, something you did not deal with for 30 years as you were in a dungeon, to use your words. Your September 2024 assessment comes to the following: diagnostic impressions, abusive alcohol use, in prolonged remission in a controlled environment, issues of voyeurism and sexual sadism at the forefront, with no signs of acting out since he has been in a controlled environment, and a personality disorder marked as narcissistic vulnerabilities and certain antisocial traits. In your opinion, you began work on yourself by resolving your self-esteem issues. You claim that sexual sadism can change in as little as a year, and that you did the work. You say you are not engaged in sexuality, that you do not want to find women attractive as it would reportedly be objectifying to them. You say you have not practiced masturbation in years and that your libido is low, partially due to your age. Bernardo had identified 2 community-based residential facilities to the parole board where he wanted to be housed while on day parole. He also suggested day parole from a minimum security institution. At first, you will search for a low-skill manual labor job, but you also wish to engage in academic upgrading and job training. You have no debts and around $2,000 in savings. You would like to transition from a facility to a residency in the same area. Bernardo conceded that he didn't have a plan for parole, and he acknowledged the need for gradual integration. Short of day parole, Bernardo's case management officer did not recommend unsupervised temporary absences be granted. By reoffending, the officer said, Bernardo presents an undue risk to society. In their explanation of denial, the board continued to say that aggravating your risk is the nature of your criminal behavior. It has been violent, brutal, serial, predatory, and lethal, escalating in severity over the course of several years. You victimized multiple women, their families, and the community at large. You videotaped some of your brutality with the victims, demonstrating a deep lack of concern for them and harming their families even further. Your actions demonstrated no regard for the victims, their well-being, or their significant pain, terror, and distress. Your explanation at the hearing that you drugged the last 2 victims because you did not want them to suffer after all the suffering you had already caused them demonstrates a significant compartmentalization and a certain minimization of your behavior. The board has also noted that the victim impact statements on file and those read out during the recent hearings, demonstrating continued, deep, serious, and persistent harm caused by your actions. The board concluded by saying that Bernardo has opportunities to invest more deeply in an exploration of his understanding of his criminal behavior and of the challenges that await him in the community, which he appears to minimize. He is eligible to apply for another parole board review in 2026. Bernardo's name remains so toxic that almost anything to do with the case causes scandal or outrage. He did show self-awareness at his parole hearing on this topic. He said, there's perception, as we know from the media, of me out there, and it's a very negative perception. The hearing, Bernardo said, is a lot of stress, especially when it was on the news. They were talking about it in the House of Commons. I'm always news. I will be news after this hearing. 60 is my statistical age of death, Bernardo said, meaning dying of natural causes as an inmate who spent years in solitary. It's cruel and unusual punishment from the psychological effects to me. I know many people say, good, I can't stand him, screw him, I know that. But people are able to repent, and they should be given the opportunity, and that's what I'm asking for. Ryan Mahaffey's comment deserves to be the last thing said in this video. He said Bernardo was sentenced as a murderer and dangerous offender to life in prison for what he did. That life is not yet over. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you all have a blessed holiday. Stay safe, and I will talk to you soon.